Okay, hello everyone. In this video lecture, we're going to talk about something that's a little bit more difficult for some people to understand. That is the gross autopsy rate versus the net autopsy rate. Here's the difference between the two. The gross autopsy rate is the number of autopsies in the numerator, and that figure is divided by the number of inpatient deaths for the same time period. So very straightforward, includes typically all autopsies, including newborns, unless per the hospital, they want a separate newborn autopsy rate. Here's where things get confusing about the net autopsy rate. For coroner's cases, medical examiner cases like unattended deaths, what have you, those that are taken away from the hospital as an inpatient death and done somewhere else, they're not available. So we want to look at the net autopsy rate. So it's going to be similar in the case of we're going to have the total number of autopsies done at the hospital for a time period. And the denominator is going to be the number of inpatient deaths, and we're going to subtract those medical examiner cases out. So that will give us our net autopsy rate. Let's take a look at how we can do this in Excel. Okay, so in this example, we have 50 inpatient deaths in a month, and we have 10 autopsies that were done in the same month. So the gross autopsy rate, we know from the formula in our book is going to be press equals to do the formula, and we're just going to click on the cells. It's going to be the number of autopsies done in a month, which in this case is 10, divided by the number of inpatient deaths in the same month. And we get 0.2, and we can right mouse click, format the cells, go out 2 decimal places, and we get 20%. That is our gross autopsy rate. Now we're going to take a look at the net autopsy rate. So this looks similar. Again, we have our 50 inpatient deaths, 10 autopsies, but there were 5 medical examiner cases. So again, we're going to do something similar with the formulas. We're going to click on the cell where we want the result. We're going to press equals, and then we're going to go 10 autopsies, divide just like we did last time, but in this case, we're going to use the parentheses just like we used to in algebra. And it's going to be a quantity, and it's going to be the quantity of cell B2, which is 50, minus 5, which is in C2, as we can see, and then we press enter. And then we have that, and we can select the whole column, reformat into percentage, go out 2 places, and we wind up with 22.22%. So that's the difference between how we calculate the gross autopsy rate and the net. Big thing that I think people stumble on is they try to subtract the wrong things out or forget to subtract. Again, here's the formula. It's going to be A2, which is the number of autopsies, and then we're going to subtract not 50, but in this case, we're going to subtract 5 from 50 in parens, and we wind up with 22.22%. I hope you found that useful. Please stop by office hours if you have any questions about net autopsy rate, gross autopsy rate, or anything else in Chapter 7. Thank you so much. Have a great week. We'll talk to you soon. Bye now.